Hi friends, Father Kerry here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on two paths to mysticism. You know, we live in a culture in which language, I believe, is increasingly bastardized. And by that I mean at least this: we have forgotten, either willfully or indeliberately, the deep meaning of many words. And as a consequence, those words can no longer guide us into a deeper and richer understanding of reality. One of those words whose meaning has been trivialized is mysticism, or any of its cognates: mystic, mystical. Time and again, I hear people use the word mysticism to refer to phenomena such as mental spoon bending, or mind reading, or levitation, or Ouija board stuff, or tarot reading forecasts. Sometimes I hear people refer to themselves as mystics if they have a rather nebulous, amorphous, undifferentiated kind of spirituality. But the word mysticism, at least in the Christian tradition, doesn't refer to any of these things. Instead, mysticism in the Christian tradition is a heightened experience of God, purely and simply. A mystic is an individual who has a heightened experience of the holy mystery of God. Now, there are many different ways to think about Christian mysticism, but I would suggest to you that the most convenient way, and I also think it's a very reliable way, to think about Christian mysticism is in terms of, on the one hand, everyday mysticism, and on the other hand, peak mysticism. These two kinds of mysticisms, these two paths, are called by any number of different titles. Sometimes they're called positive, and sometimes they're called negative paths. Sometimes they're referred to as the via immanenta, and sometimes they're referred to as the via negativa. Sometimes they are referred to as apophatic mysticism, and sometimes they are referred to as cataphatic mysticism. And all of those labels are interesting and important. But it seems to me that we can boil all of them down to two labels: everyday mysticism and peak mysticism. Now, what do I mean by everyday mysticism? The 20th century theologian Karl Rahner once said, and I think wisely said, that you and I have an inherent knowledge of God. Because we come from God and are stamped in God's likeness, our way of looking at the world is always read through the lens of God knowledge. God, as Rahner famously says, is the horizon of our experience. Now, granted, sometimes that awareness of God as the horizon of our experience, that is, the awareness of God as the boundary of everything that we experience, isn't explicitly felt by a given person. Sometimes it only lurks implicitly in the background, but it nonetheless is there, says Rahner. And if we discipline ourselves to understand this inherent knowledge of God within us, Rahner says, then we can begin to look at the world around us and see God in it everywhere. We can sense the presence of the holy mystery in the most seemingly trivial aspect of our lives, as well as the dramatic aspects of our lives. God will be present to both our understanding and our experience. It will be as if we catch glimpses of God in the here and the now, in the this and the that of everyday living. One of the proponents of everyday mysticism was the American Quaker Rufus Jones, and in one of his books he writes something I think that is a quite beautiful description of this everyday mysticism. This is what Jones says: "The everyday mystic finds the revelation of God in the finite around him or her. Nothing now is unimportant. There is more in the least event than the ordinary eye sees. Every situation may be turned into an occasion for winning a nearer view of God. The most stubborn fact which fronts one in the path may be made a revelation of divine glory. For to this mystic, the everyday mystic, every finite fact may become an open window into the divine. And how do we open our eyes in order to sense the presence of the holy mystery in the world around us? How do we bring that implicit understanding of God to the forefront? Well, traditionally through prayer and love and service. We discipline ourselves in the ways of God in order to sense God's presence in the world. That's the path of everyday mysticism. And my friends, as Karl Rahner says, and as Rufus Jones himself says, every person has the ability to follow this mystical path. But there is also a second mystical path, what I'm calling here the peak mystical path. And it is when an individual loses herself in an experience of God. In this kind of a mystical experience, there is nothing left over, as it were. When you and I experience the presence of God in the world, we are always, as it were, experiencing it from our perspective. We remain who we are. God remains who God is. There is a subject-object relationship going on. We are, if you will, a spectator realizing that we are spectating. But in a peak mystical experience, that separation between subject and object disappears. The experience of God in a peak mystical experience is totalizing. There is nothing left over. There is nothing but God. Everything is swept to one side, including one's self-awareness, including one's ego. The interesting thing about these kinds of experiences, unlike, once again, everyday mystical experiences, is that we can experience them in the fullest possible way, but we have a great deal of difficulty in describing them afterwards. We experience with peak mystical experiences, but we don't really understand them. Remember what St. Augustine said in his famous Sermon 52? Si comprehendis non est Deus. If you think you understand after having one of these experiences, you don't. If you think you have pinned God down because you've had a peak experience, you haven't. On the everyday mystical path, however, experience and knowledge is combined. We are able to think about what it is that we have experienced, to put it into words. With the peak mystical experience, the best we can do is speak in circles after the experience is over, using metaphors, using poetry, frequently the poetry of love. Let me read to you one of the most famous descriptions of a peak mystical experience. It's from the 6th century mystic Dionysius the Areopagite. It's from his book entitled Mystical Theology. This is what he writes. Do thou then, in the intent practice of mystic contemplation, peak experience mysticism, leave behind the senses and the operations of the intellect, and all things that the senses or the intellect can perceive, and all things which are not, and things which are, and strain upwards in unknowing, so far as may be, towards the union with him who is above all things and knowledge. For by unceasing and absolute withdrawal from thyself and all things, abandoning all and set free from all, thou shalt be borne up to the ray of divine darkness that surpasses all being. So these two mystical paths, my friends, the path of the everyday and the path of the peak, are open to those who have established a relationship with the living God, for those who yearn for a deeper relationship with the Holy Mystery. In everyday mysticism, we sense the presence of God in the world. We have an experience of God that is mediated through and by our understanding. In a peak mystical experience, the experience of unification with God is overwhelming. It is totalizing. There's nothing left over. And consequently, we have a very difficult time understanding, much less speaking, what has happened. This is good to remember in this Holy Week of Easter. It's good to remember that the Holy Mystery is always available to us, regardless of which path we take. Now, one question remains, and it's a question that I'll take up in a future Holy Spirit moment. How can we trust either of these mystical paths? How can I be sure, whether I'm talking about the everyday mystical path or the peak mystical path, that what I am truly experiencing is God, as opposed to, for example, a movement of self-deception on my part? We'll talk about that later. For now, my friends, this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for viewing. If you are of a mind, I invite you to subscribe to this series. Thanks again. God bless. See you soon.